Good morning to everyone in the United States. Good afternoon to people joining us from Europe, and a welcome to everyone, regardless of your location. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really delighted to bring this group of people together to talk today about transatlantic security, and in particular about the United States and German partnership and their partnership with their European allies. We are 1 month from the summit meetings that happened in June with US President Biden and his counterparts from the G7, from the NATO alliance, and also from the European Union. And a significant characteristic of those discussions was not only the traditional elements of security and defense, but also what we've gotten in the habit of calling new threats, even though they aren't exactly new. And in particular, the role that technology plays and the technological edge for the transatlantic community, which has been so crucial over the years. And so with that in mind, I'm really pleased to welcome our very senior group of speakers and guests today. And we are going to have a discussion about the way forward after the Brussels and Cornwall summits for transatlantic security. I will start with the introductory remarks from a senior Pentagon official, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. And then we will have a panel offer their comments, and then we'll get to discussion with you, the audience, and bring you into this conversation. So let me start by introducing our speaker who will give us some keynote remarks, and that is Spencer Boyer. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO Policy. Spencer has been a senior government official in previous administrations as well, including as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and as the National Intelligence Officer for Europe. We will then have reactions and comments from Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, who is the new Chief Executive of the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP in Berlin. Linas Linkevičius, who is the former Foreign Minister and former Defense Minister of Lithuania, also has been a permanent representative to NATO, among many other positions. And Sandy Vershbow, former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, former US Ambassador to NATO, to Russia, and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, among many other positions. So we've got a great group of people here to provide us with some perspective on these issues. And with that, I want to get right to it with you, Spencer Boyer, and open the floor. Spencer, could you please give us your thoughts about the way forward, and we'll look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jeff, and hopefully everybody can hear me well. But I'm really, really pleased to be here today, and I'm looking forward to offering a few perspectives from the Department of Defense, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff, to see if we have time for a question or two, and then we'll move on with the program. I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole thing, but it looks like a really terrific panel with an amazing lineup. So let me just begin with a few words about this administration's approach to NATO, the European Union, the transatlantic relationship, as well as future cooperation. I'll talk for about 10 or 12 minutes, and then again, turn it back over to you, Jeff. So, as I think most people on this call know, President Biden, Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken have all stated that NATO is the essential forum for consultation, decision-making, and action on transatlantic matters. And it really is the foundation upon which our collective security and our shared prosperity is built. Secretary Austin's first call to a foreign leader as Defense Secretary was to NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, which I think is significant. President Biden's first travel of his presidency was to Europe, which I think was really significant. And I think sent a very important signal about what our priorities are. Additionally, the communique from the June 14th NATO summit, which I'll address more in a minute, reaffirmed the shared values of the NATO alliance and the commitment to address common threats to these values. The president, I think, made very, very clear during his visit to Europe that the US commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty is sacred, it's unshakable, emphasizing a renewed focus on revitalizing our relationship with the alliance. The president also reaffirmed the enduring transatlantic bond that exists through NATO. In harmony with our broader national security goals, the Department of Defense continues to prioritize working with NATO allies to improve readiness, to increase the speed of allied decision-making, and to improve military mobility across Europe. And the NATO summit, I think, really did showcase alliance unity, cohesion, and strength in moving in that direction. But before discussing a few key summit outcomes, let me just talk about a few of the ways that DoD and my office in particular, our European and NATO Affairs Office, fed into the process. In advance of the summit, we spent a lot of time helping craft language in the communique. And as many of you know who have been part of this process, either through state or DoD, this requires many rounds of negotiation, sometimes painful negotiation, but I think we got to a great place. Above all, we wanted to ensure that the communique highlighted the alliance's #1 job from our perspective, which is credible deterrence and defense. Additionally, we identified areas that we think are very important to the United States as well, which we call the 3 Cs. There are a lot of 3 Cs out there, but for the purposes of this discussion, China, cyber, and climate. With regards to China, the communique highlighted its growing influence and the challenges it presents to the rules-based international order, as well as other relevant threats to the alliance and our security. I think this is the first time, or a first for the alliance in many ways, in terms of the emphasis on China. And we really pushed to include very strong language, such as talking about its assertive behavior and coercive policies. You'll also notice the tough language on cyber, where the alliance reaffirmed that a cyber attack could lead to the invocation of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Leaders also endorsed a new cyber defense policy to improve alliance resilience against malicious activity. And we were consulted significantly in this area, again, not just my office, but throughout OSD policy. And on climate change, the communique describes it as one of the defining challenges of our time, a threat multiplier. We fully agree with this. DoD has expanded its efforts to address the security challenges of climate change. And, after an administration that viewed climate change differently, we have a renewed focus on that now, and we're really pleased to see leaders endorse an action plan for the NATO agenda on climate change and security. An important deliverable for this summit was also Secretary General's 2030 plan. The initiative makes the alliance fit for the future and is extremely ambitious. It seeks to strengthen allies' practical commitment to deterrence and defense, increasing our resilience, addressing the security implications of climate change, as I mentioned, promoting defense innovation, enhancing political coordination, including cooperation with like-minded democracies around the world, updating NATO's strategic concept, and substantially and gradually increasing NATO common funded budgets. That was, all within the NATO 2030 plan. The Secretary General led this process, which was informed by multiple stakeholders, including the United States. And so we were very much part of this process from day one. So let me talk now a little bit more about some of the key summit outcomes, which did incorporate elements of the Secretary General's NATO 2030 initiative. And let me stress that while the headlines were about the improved tone and America being back, which I think was all true, there was a lot of substance as well that sometimes I think was overlooked in media reports about what happened at the summit. Leaders agreed to revise a NATO strategic concept, which is a framework that will guide the alliance and its approach to the evolving strategic environment. We'll push for a strong focus from the US perspective on credible deterrence and defense, as well as strong language about Russia and China. Other areas like cyber, space, and resilience will certainly also be considered. The Secretary General has already initiated this process for developing the strategic concept, and there will be a period of consultations with capitals and other relevant stakeholders followed by textual review and negotiations. This process will be completed by the next Leaders Summit in 2022. Against the backdrop of recent ransomware attacks on major companies, leaders endorsed a new cyber defense policy that will strengthen allied coordination to ensure that the alliance is resilient against the increasingly frequent and severe threats from malicious cyber activities from both state and non-state actors. Leaders affirmed the NATO's ability to ensure our common defense relies on maintaining our technological edge. Allies launched a defense innovation accelerator to facilitate their technological cooperation and speed the adoption of emerging technologies that will enhance the alliance's defense. Meeting the demands of accelerating climate challenges, leaders agreed to a climate security action plan, which I was referencing, and set the ambition for NATO to become a leader among international organizations for understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change on security. A key element of the action plan is an agreement to reduce greenhouse gases from military activities and installations in line with national commitments under the Paris Agreement and the initiation of a regular high-level global climate and security dialogue. Leaders committed to implement the military concepts and strategies that strengthen NATO's deterrence and defense posture to meet threats from Russia and elsewhere. As I mentioned, I think this is probably job number one for the alliance. The summit reinforced greater sharing of responsibility, sometimes called burden sharing. I think we often use language of sharing of responsibility at this point. Non-US defense spending has risen for the last 7 years since the Wales investment pledge adopted in 2014 during the Obama administration, and leaders recommitted to this during the summit, which I think is incredibly important. And I do think that we should all be happy and recognize the progress that's been made over 7 years through both administrations in terms of increasing defense spending. Following the recognition of greater sharing of responsibility, leaders committed to ensuring that NATO is led, staffed, and resourced at levels necessary to deliver on the decisions taken at the summit. They agreed to identify the additional resources, including through NATO common funding, to enhance NATO's ability to meet security challenges today and in the future. Leaders also committed to enhance political coordination on all matters related to their national and collective security, and reaffirmed commitment to our common values, which include individual liberty, human rights, democracy, rule of law. I think that's incredibly important. Furthermore, the summit affirmed the national and collective resilience as being essential for credible deterrence and defense, and vital to safeguard our societies, citizens, and our shared values. And finally, the summit enhanced NATO's ability to strengthen the rules-based international order by increasing dialogue and practical cooperation with alliance partners, including the European Union and those in the Indo-Pacific, such as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea. Leaders also recommitted to NATO's open door policy, which provides a path for membership to any European country that shares our values and meets the necessary responsibilities and obligations. And so just a brief word in closing about the US-EU summit, which in some ways was overshadowed by the NATO summit, but was also incredibly important and worth focusing on. It happened right after the NATO gathering, and I think it was a great affair. It was a prime opportunity to reset the US-EU relationship, which was severely strained during the last administration, as was our relationship with many other allies and partners. During the summit, leaders addressed a wide range of issues, including those of common concern, including COVID-19, climate, trade and investment, technology, foreign affairs, and common values, and also focused on ways to increase defense cooperation between the US and EU, which was a primary focus for DoD leading up to that summit. DoD is very pleased to see a commitment to work towards an administrative arrangement between the United States and the European Defense Agency. This is a crucial development from our perspective that will foster greater cooperation on transatlantic security and defense issues. From our perspective, a strong transatlantic relationship is more important than ever to overcome the challenges that the world is facing. I often say there is no challenge in the world that we can solve alone without our strongest partners in NATO in particular, but many partners around the world, including throughout Europe, partners and allies alike. In addition to strong US-EU ties, deepening NATO-EU cooperation on issues like hybrid, cybersecurity, China, safeguarding critical infrastructure will help us build our resilience and preparedness against a range of threats that we face today and in the future. And with the return of the United States to the Paris Agreement, there's a great opportunity for the United States to work together with the EU to shape a comprehensive transatlantic green agenda. As you can see with the NATO-endorsed climate action plan that I was discussing, there's a lot that can be done between the EU and NATO to work together on climate issues. So in closing, let me just say, that I affirm, the administration really does affirm how terrific these summits were, and we were very pleased to see so much progress on issues of joint concern, United States and our allies. And we really look forward to working closely with the Alliance and our European partners more broadly on our collective security goals, both through NATO as well as through EU-US cooperation. So let me turn it back over to you, Jeff, and see if we have time for a question or two.
Well, thanks so much, Spencer. I really appreciate the very sweeping description and the details on some of the particular initiatives that are high on the American agenda with our European allies and partners. If I could zero in on one thing that you highlighted, and I think to paraphrase, you said, top priority is the deterrence and defense policy, and I'd like to ask what we should look for as next steps, coming up in the weeks and months to come, because there's an ambitious agenda, including approving a new strategic concept at a summit next year. And so I'm sure you're already working toward some of those objectives. So what should we be looking for in the weeks and months to come?
Sure. You mentioned the strategic concept. I think this is going to take a lot of time and energy. Just to elaborate a little bit more, obviously the strategic concept that was agreed in 2010 has served NATO well, but the world has fundamentally changed since that time. We've seen much more troubling behavior from Russia, including attempted annexation of Crimea, ongoing destabilization in Ukraine, broad military buildup, cyber threats have grown exponentially. Obviously, China's aggressive behavior needs to be addressed in this strategic concept, but it's a long process where we have to get agreement from everybody, which takes time, multiple rounds, and within capitals, there's going to be lots of interagency discussions about what that looks like in the United States, of course, not just DOD, state, White House, other stakeholders in this will certainly give opinions about what we should see in that. And then there's a whole process for how we feed into that. In terms of common funding, which was a big issue for the summit, there were a lot of back and forth discussions in terms of what that should look like. Some of the original proposals, had to be sort of nuanced and discussed in terms of language that everybody feel comfortable with, in terms of a gradual increase in common funding to help the alliance meet all of the challenges that we're being asked to address. So now there's a process of moving that to military authorities who can give advice on, okay, how do we move forward? What are the very specific needs? How to make this a bottom-up process now that we've had political agreement that, yes, we need to move in that direction, but now the devil's in the details of what that looks like. And so there will be a process that needs to be fed into for making that a reality.
Okay, and if I could just take time for one last question before you have to go. You've talked about the common funding aspect of burden sharing, and I think many of our viewers will be aware that the amount of money that NATO spends on commonly funded activities is relatively small compared to the national defense budgets in the United States and in our allies. So could you say a little bit more about the kind of political military diplomacy when it comes to burden sharing on the part of American allies? Of course, that's been a through line for multiple administrations. But what is it that the United States would like to see more of in terms of the resource commitments coming from its important, its key allies?
Sure. Just in terms of national budgets, again, we've had a 2% benchmark of the amount of GDP spent on defense spending, and we've been moving towards that, and we've been moving in a positive direction, as I've mentioned, over the last 7 years. And I think that we should feel good about that. Are we where we need to be? Not yet. Some of the goals of getting there by 2024 that originally had been agreed to, had been extended by some countries, but I think folks are moving in the right direction. And so that's something that we need to encourage, while we obviously want to focus on capabilities and, not only a number, the 2% number we still think is important. And I think NATO Secretary General still thinks that is important. And so, we discuss that, not only within a NATO context, but also bilaterally as well. And I think that there is a commitment, and there was a renewed commitment at the summit to keep moving in that direction. Also, there's a whole process for NATO defense planning where there are targets that our allies are given in terms of things that they need to do, in terms of our alliance capabilities and readiness and so forth. And that process is going on now. And we encourage all of our allies to meet those targets. In terms of common funding, again, there's the national budgets, but the common funding, is there to, alleviate shortfalls in deterrence and defense activities and force generation, to cover certain costs associated with training and exercises, contributes to alliance readiness, and enables NATO to work on a lot of key issues, such as cyber and climate and other things. As you mentioned, Jeff, which I think is really important, common funding across the 3 NATO common funded budgets totaled a little over $3 billion. Recently, this sum equates to about 0.3% of total allied defense spending required to run the entire organization, its commands, its military infrastructure. So it's really a small number in comparison to sort of the big numbers that we're looking at for national defense budgets. Doesn't mean that it still isn't, doesn't pinch a little bit for folks to increase that common funding. Of course it does, but we know that this is essential for NATO to be able to do all the things that we're asking it to do in the future. And I'm pleased that we got agreement in the communique to at least move forward, in increasing common funded budgets. And now, again, the devil is in the details of how do we make that happen? What exactly are we looking at? And hopefully by next year, we have a clearer picture.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Spencer, for making time to be with us today. I want to express our appreciation, and we look forward to remaining in contact and certainly continuing to look at these really vital issues that you're working on. So thanks very much, Spencer Boyer.
Thank you so much for having me.
And with that, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, I'd like to turn to you and ask from a perspective in Germany. How do you see the compatibility of these objectives that the United States has laid out with German priorities? Of course, we're entering an election season in Germany, and so do you see more unanimity than discord there, or what are the pitfalls that you see?
Well, first of all, Jeff, thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be in such esteemed company. And I see from our guest list, lots of friends. So I'm glad you've got just the right group together to discuss this. And I'm also looking forward to our interactions with the audience. As Spencer Boyer just pointed out, this communique is full of American priorities, but these American priorities do the German political landscape a great favor. And that might be a bit surprising because since we just ended on the point of defense spending, which has always been a sore spot in the German debate, because you leaned into this election campaign, what not only the NATO 2030 process does, but how the communique is structured is, of course, to say, not only do we need to spend more, but we need to spend differently and smarter. And if you look at how difficult, particularly the public debate has been around defense, I think, you see now in this flood catastrophe, the first time I think that Germans have really come into, in German we say Tuchfühlung, into very close contact with their own military. That's how German military assets are not necessarily in the country understood to be a strategic asset in the way that we think about it in an American context of a full international relations toolkit. It just goes to show how disconnected a public debate and public understanding of the essential capacity of its own military, despite the fact that it has a number of really structural issues that need to be resolved very urgently by whatever the coming administration is. The reframing of issues around common capability, operational issues, around an increase in spending in technology, the sort of stronger emphasis on the climate transformation. I mean, all the things that effectively the Pentagon has already proven. If you think about the functionality of the Defense Innovation Board, if you think about the now longstanding efforts of the Pentagon to ultimately make its own missions fossil fuel free, all those things that are in there work to actually kind of make the deeper strategic objectives of the NATO 2030 process more palatable to a German public. And so I actually think those elements could play very well as part of an election campaign. Mm-hmm. Here comes the bad news. That being said, that sort of debate, that kind of strategic level of debate and need is something that is not generally part of a German election campaign, nor is foreign policy generally a particular focus of any German election campaign. That being said, of course, things are heating up because we have seen that the threats are perceived as much more real and lived. Obviously, in this past week, the threat of climate change has been extremely vivid in this country. I also think the communique was wise to sort of front load the Russia questions because those remain vivid for a German public. But for the past roughly 4 years, despite the fact that we saw some pretty rapid progress between 2014 and 2017 in terms of defense spending, operational capability building, interagency processes, those have been effectively quagmired since 2017 for different reasons that we could get into now. So you have extreme issues within the German defense debate, which is to say that capability issues remain. The procurement process is stuck in extreme German bureaucracies, which is to say it doesn't actually help any of the nimble-minded goals that NATO has within its concept framework. So that's a huge issue. So you'd really need a dedicated process to reorganize the German defense sector. And the problem is that the backdrop for it in the public is that there's very little understanding for, precisely that need. Because of course that costs money. And the public debate, and we've had, parties within the German party political system that over the past, not only in this election cycle, but over the past years now have floated things like, wanting to leave the American nuclear umbrella. I mean, things that are just not realistic, but begin to influence a public understanding of what is essential in the use of defense capabilities for not only obviously the protection of Germany, but really this idea of rebalancing a threat architecture in the world. And so the biggest Achilles heel will always remain the German public opinion that holds the taxpayers' purse strings, because this administration over the past 16 years in its different constellations has arguably failed, bar a slight blip in 2014, where you had the Munich consensus that you needed more German responsibility in the world, fail to educate a German public to be fully invested in these deeper transformational processes you need. So in that sense, I think the NATO concept helps because it reframes the defense questions in a wider sort of public policy frame, but the work will still need to be done at home. And right now, the German public is not fully prepared to do the work that would make NATO 2030 and the concept functional by the deadlines that NATO has set itself.
Right. So thank you, Cathryn. And let me turn to Linas Linkevičius because Lithuania is, in a way, it is the host of the Enhanced Forward Presence, a battle group led by Germany on Lithuanian soil. And in that way, you are at the nexus between this increased responsibility that Cathryn was talking about, but also the challenges of German public opinion, of the German defense bureaucracy. So, Linas, can I ask, how do you assess this German position and perhaps this disconnect that Cathryn was talking about?
Oh, it's difficult to assess. Good morning, first of all, and thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. It's very difficult to assess the position, but I just can to say that this enhanced forward presence idea and implementation by Germans and all accumulation of around 10 allied nations it's not a terribly big force. It's just battalion size battle group, but core functions are laid on the shoulders of Germany, definitely. And they are coming very disciplined in German style, also with heavy kind of machines, Leopard tanks, APCs. And I hope and I believe since the time when I contacted with them and talked, they're feeling quite comfortable. So it's also very important. And they're understanding the tasks they're implementing. So the mission importance, it's very difficult to overestimate or underestimate, even having the limited and symbolic, one can say, size. But the deterrence function, it's really necessary in this situation. Having in mind that we are not going to escalate anything or to create more tension, but just minimum what should be done, this minimum footprint is really implemented very efficiently. And I hope it will be continued. That's very important to note. Also, I'd like to say that this is done in parallel with the US efforts, because they have also their national contingent deployed. And this is happening for a fourth time without any gaps. By the way, politically, it's not called as permanent deployment. They are calling that enduring or whatever. But practically, it is permanent because there are no gaps and some footprint already exists on our soil. So all in all, I would like to say this really size is really limited. In addition, we have air policing provided by allies, also 4-6 jets, kind of limited force, which is also not just experts, but everybody understands it's not air defense, it's just air policing. So it's also minimum to show that we are controlling the situation. And this is definitely something we would like to see in the future as well, to be continued. And the role, as I said, of Germany is very important, just because it's not only because it's a framework nation, but because it's a vehicle of and kind of guarantor of the tendencies we will have in the alliance in general, especially in the European pillar. And here, when we are talking now, debating this new, so to say, stage of our development after the last summit in particular, we really expect quite more concord between these two wings, Euro-Atlantic, both sides of the ocean, and especially US-Germany tandem could be really very efficient. Knowing all these peculiarities in the past, and knowing tensions in the present, but nevertheless, we have some hopes that that will be really the case. And we would like to contribute somehow, definitely, as well, as a host nation, as those who are on the front line of hybrid threats, I would say that also. Let me add, Jeff, if you allow me, just to say that we are now experiencing the situation when arsenal menu of this hybrid threats really expanding, enriching, and we experiencing firsthand all that from happening. If it wasn't in some time ago, we were talking about the region, let's say, green men in Ukraine, right? It was also, let me remind, humanitarian convoys, which were bringing not humanitarian assistance, but military backup to the those who were fighting like terrorists with the government forces in Ukraine. I would mention also hijacking of civilian plane, which was also used. It was by Belarusians, but let me add also that Belarus, according to our observations, becoming testing polygon for methods, what could be used and what would be reaction of the allies, not just of us nationally, but of us collectively, I mean, by NATO, by European Union. I would add one more leverage now, and when we're weaponizing migration, and that was not hide it, by the way, it was openly said by Lukashenko that he will use migrants to test our resilience, and he's doing that as we speak. Frankly, this is also taking place. So not to continue too much and too long, just to say that arsenal of hybrid methods, it's enriching, and that's therefore we have to adjust not only our strategy, which is going to be adopted by the next summit, as we understand NATO strategic concept. Hopefully, it will be enriched, but we should take into account this new tendencies. And troops deployed here also should adjust to new situation. Now we will have, again, Zapad approaching exercises, quite famous exercises. We know that there was always, regardless of the propaganda, but they were always offensive exercises with some new scenario, how to attack NATO, how to, again, test our resilience, our readiness. And I believe this time will not be exception, because there are even more challenges ahead because of this forceful unification with Belarus, Russia with Belarus, with all consequences. Zapad was always used very intensively by Russia during the exercises, Belarusian territory. So this time it will be not just the exception, but even more probably methods will be tested, including hybrid. That's the case. So those who are exercising NATO mission on our territory of our region, they also should take that into account. And again, definitely, needless to say, framework nation is more responsible for coordination of this vigilance and resilience in general. So that would be my comment on your remarks.
Back to this question of cohesion as well in our discussion. And let me remind our viewers, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose questions that you would like to bring into our discussion. I would encourage you to make sure it's a question and to make it as concise as possible so that we can bring as many as we can into the discussion. Sandy Vershbow, I'd like to turn to you now and ask for your view on this balance between U.S. leadership and the policy agenda that we've heard outlined today, but also the expectations of American allies. You know, you've been at the intersection of these issues as a U.S. ambassador to NATO, as a Deputy Secretary General, in addition to other functions. How do you see this taking shape?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jeff, for including me on this very high-powered panel. It's a great opportunity. I would say, first of all, that the Biden administration has really made an excellent start in undoing a lot of the damage of the last few years and rebuilding the transatlantic relationship and restoring trust and confidence on the part of the Europeans after 4 years of bullying and friction under Donald Trump. And he's put that values and multilateralism back at the center of the agenda, which I think bodes well for a strong unified approach across the Atlantic. And Biden is obviously an Atlanticist in his bones, a true believer in NATO, maybe even more than me, and also a believer in partnership with the European Union, which I consider myself very much a Europhile as well. He knows that you can't just go back to where we left off in 2017. The world has changed, the threats have evolved. China has risen to the top of the charts in terms of the strategic challenges to the democratic world. But Russia is still there as the most immediate threat, and if anything, it's getting more aggressive, more unpredictable, more provocative, even in recent months. So at the same time, Biden has a heavy domestic burden to carry, but he knows that these international challenges won't wait, and it makes it all the more essential that the United States draw on the combined strength of its European and other allies around the world. We can't simply do it alone. So I see this as a tremendous opportunity for the European members of the alliance and the EU to work with us to establish a much more balanced partnership across the Atlantic. And in fact, this is not just a nice to have, it's an essential thing, because the US is likely to start to shift some of its focus and its actual armed forces to the Asia Pacific region. So Europe is going to have to take up some of the slack, assume more responsibility for the defense of Europe and for the management of crises and instability in the wider European neighborhood. And in this regard, I think the Biden administration is much less hung up than any of its predecessors on the idea of a stronger European pillar within NATO and an increased security role for the European Union. They're very pragmatic. They're looking for results, not rhetoric. They're looking for capabilities, looking for actions that will benefit both NATO and the EU. And they aren't going to get too hung up on the theology of strategic autonomy, assuming that that is not just rhetoric, but it actually is a lever for more action and more responsibility. I think Biden also understands that Europeans still have some doubts about the staying power of the shift back to traditional Atlanticism that Biden represents. And this concern isn't unreasonable if you just take a look at the US press on any given day and see just how polarized our politics have become. But I think that the success of the week of summits in June, and also Chancellor Merkel's visit to Washington last week, which I would group together with the multilateral events, indicates that both sides of the Atlantic agree that the time for hesitation is past. We can't just sit back and be reactive to events. We have to shape events, galvanize the transatlantic community into action. And I think that the summits get us off to a very good start. But of course, these are impressive documents, the NATO communique, the other US, EU, and G7 declarations. But those pieces of paper now have to be translated into action. That's, the hard part begins now. When it comes specifically to defense, fortunately, NATO didn't suffer any irreparable damage under Trump, thanks to the famous adults in the room. There was some setbacks in the final year, particularly the announcement of withdrawals from Germany, which Biden thankfully is planning to reverse. But I think the administration can safely build on the work that's been unfolding since the 2014 Wales Summit, the Warsaw and the Brussels summits that followed, in terms of strengthening deterrence and defense, which includes, I think, continued commitment to European Deterrence Initiative, to the enhanced forward presence, rotational presence in the East, as well as broadening the scope of NATO's defense and deterrence strategy in new directions as reflected in the NATO 2030 initiative. Now, resources are going to be crucial to implementing this very ambitious agenda. Unfortunately, the summit did not resolve all the differences on common funding. Spencer tried to put a good face on it, but there was a bit of a fudge. I think Germany wasn't the problem child. I think it was France, more than any other country, that was reluctant to commit to any specific target for increasing common funding. But this is going to be essential, and I think Germany has a big responsibility if the Paris-Berlin axis is going to be useful, is to convince the French that there are specific areas where common funding is going to spell the difference between success and failure for the alliance. Now, most capabilities, as you mentioned, Jeff, come out of national defense budgets and depend on robust defense spending. And Germany still is unfortunately a laggard in that department. But I think that there's still a lot of specific areas, irrespective of the top line and the defense budget for Germany, where more could be done in implementing this defense and deterrence strategy that's spelled out in paragraphs 20 to 23 of the communique. For example, the enhanced forward presence battle group in Lithuania could be augmented with permanent or rotational air defense capabilities, more artillery, pre-positioning of the equipment for another brigade so that the rapid reinforcement can happen much more quickly, particularly with the bottlenecks that still exist on military mobility. Germany could play a big role in the EU in remedying the funding shortfall that has led the EU to basically let NATO down when it comes to military mobility. More needs to be done in the Black Sea and building up the tailored forward presence in the south, and here too Germany could make contributions. And NATO is going to have to engage in a large buildup of its integrated air and missile defense capabilities in the face of the Russian violation of the INF Treaty and deployment of new missile systems of various kinds. So a lot of specific things that could be done even if you don't hit the 2% goal. My own hope, and this may be a vain hope, is that European allies could see this current moment in history as a chance to aim even higher, to agree specifically on a European level of ambition within NATO that would become the goal for the year 2030. For example, aiming to provide 50% of the main combat capabilities and enablers that are provided these days almost exclusively by the United States. Maybe 2030 is a little fast, but the idea of building a European joint force within the larger NATO force would, I think, be a worthy goal and would show the United States that Europe really is serious about a more equal, more balanced partnership, and would give the European members greater freedom of action in the Middle East, North Africa, without having to go to Washington and ask for intelligence support, airlift, air-to-air refueling, all these things which are the difference between launching or not launching European-led operations. So that's what I'd like to see. There's plenty of other areas where I think Germany has a big role to play, finding the concrete terms of reference for NATO's role in dealing with China. It's not going to be the main responder, but there are key areas where I think Germany could help shape the consensus, whether it's on communication technology, critical infrastructure, protection, supply chain security, where NATO has a role to play. And last but not least, Russia. We, I think, have a common framework, and the recent EU communication is an excellent counterpart to the Biden administration's emerging policy on Russia: push back, constrain, and engage. But this can't be just words. We need to think of ways to provide more leverage to the whole transatlantic community, NATO and the EU, to change Russian behavior. Otherwise, we're going to be in the same boat in Donbass and in Crimea 7 years from now as we are now 7 years after 2014. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Sandy. And I'd like to bring together a couple of comments that each of you have made with with a question we've also got from one of our viewers. And the question is about how Russia looks at NATO's growing focus on China. But I want to add to that something that each of you said. Sandy, you pointed out that Russia is becoming more aggressive. Linas, you talked about perceptions and cohesion. And Cathryn, you talked, to use your word, you said Germany has been quagmired since 2017. And so the first question, I'd open it to any who would like to respond of the three of you. Do you think NATO and the transatlantic security community right now is sending a message that is marked more by cohesion toward Russia or by disagreement? Because that ultimately is the currency of the security relationship toward Russia. Do you think that the United States and its European partners are getting that balance right?
I'll say a few words, and then I know Linas has strong views on this, and Cathryn too. I would say we are united, but there's an element of a lowest common denominator here. We've did the right thing in 2014, of course, building up our deterrence, saying there's no more business as usual, imposing sanctions, which have held up for 7 years, which in itself is an achievement. But we also have to recognize that we're not doing enough to affect Russian behavior. And if anything, Putin, because he's losing in one sense, Ukraine is more and more orienting itself towards the West and is less and less interested in any kind of partnership with Russia. But this may make Putin even more desperate. And I'm not sure we're doing enough to prevent new land grabs, continued destabilization and hybrid attacks on Ukraine. And I think we're at risk of just repeating the same nostrums that we've been repeating since 2014, or even since 2008 when it comes to Ukraine and Georgian membership. But implicitly telling the Russians, just don't steal any more territory and we'll be okay. We have to think about, can we reverse the aggression since 2014 with a combination of carrots and sticks. It's not all a question of pressure and sanctions and such, but can we convince Putin that he's better off settling with Ukraine and ending this kind of hybrid war rather than just prolonging the instability and turbulence for years to come.
Can I come in?
Please.
Sandy is quite right, saying that it's lowest common denominator, and indeed how it would be otherwise. We should agree by consensus. That's obviously the case, but it's also the case that we should draw lessons from what happened. And when it was mentioned, I'm mentioning myself many times after. Let's not mention just 2014, but war in South Caucasus 2008. It was very right reaction at that time and very tough statements, but nothing happened at that time. We came back to business as usual very soon, because the voices of pragmatism were stronger. And those few of us who were warning about another crisis somewhere else, and myself, I remember, I was also mentioning Crimea, by the way, also. That was, I couldn't expect that will be reality, but it happened. And Russia continues to test. And definitely, I also agree with Sandy, it should be, leverage should be clear, arguments should be visible, tangible, on the ground, strong. Otherwise, it makes no impression to Russia. And unfortunately, that doesn't work so far. And when we're talking about double track approach, which is also understandable logic, on one hand, keeping pressure, on the other hand, preserving dialogue, that's fine. But this enthusiasm for the dialogue shouldn't be overplayed as well, because sometimes brings no effects, no kind of results. They're creating impression of business as usual, which is not the case, even mentioned in the summit. And definitely it serves as a smoke screen for Russia to continue what Russia continues to do. So I'm afraid this is the case. And whatever crisis you would mention now, nothing was solved. The South Caucasus is the same as it was before. 20% of territory occupied, and military buildup continues, and borderization process continues. Crimea, no movement at all, even in rhetoric, to change something. On Donbass, aggression continues. Passportization also continues. One more leverage could be mentioned in the arsenal of this hybrid war, right? So Transnistria still not activated, but I believe that will come. In Nagorno-Karabakh, as we understand, Minsk group was put aside or self-isolated themselves. So how it happened, it's another discussion. But Russia and Turkey made everything according to their own wishes, and we see still the situation not resolved. And again, initiative behind Russia. So that means that we should really change something in the tactics, not talk too much about talks, but really put clear arguments on the ground, and that's exactly something we really can make some change. Let me add also Belarus. Absorption of Belarus, maybe let me put me like this, also happening as we speak. using the situation that's so-called leadership in Belarus so vulnerable, and they are definitely not controlling situation on their territory, and depending on sponsors in Kremlin, how long they will exist in generally. But Russia trying to accomplish what was started 20 years ago with the so-called Union of Two States agreement, and practically digesting this country. This is also, it's not Crimea, it's not annexation, but it's de facto disappearing, you know, so sovereign countries disappearing in our eyes. Again, what we are doing in this regard, I believe this is a good question. So that's in short would be that we cannot be complacent here somehow, and definitely we have no reason to be too proud of what we're doing, because results are absent. A very simple measurement. So resolution is clear, but results are absent. And when it was mentioned in the last summit, the importance to strengthen our efforts with regard to the resilience, it's nice, so to say, statement, but it should be backed by our concrete activity. And here, I believe something should be done, definitely practically.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you. Cathryn.
This makes me want to invite Linas to every German market square because he's so beautifully mapped out the panoply of threats that Russia poses, and that both the strategic and the tactical game that Russia is playing. And the big problem is, I agree with Sandy, that the core around the Russia question within the European Union or the European NATO allies is hardening. But look at the odd outliers that Germany and France still represent, in part for their own historic reasons. But you saw how roundly rebuffed the idea of a Russia summit was when Chancellor Merkel and Emmanuel Macron floated that. The rest of Europe immediately shut that down, which is to say that there are some realities that need some reconciliation there, and it's going to be particularly difficult. And believe you me, and I think everybody on this call knows that Vladimir Putin is looking with glee at what could be a sort of political dead zone with the sort of these two European pull powers laid lame by this odd sequence of election cycles in which a lot of decisions, particularly also financial decisions, won't be made de facto, if I think about the German budget cycle, until just before the NATO summit is supposed to meet or supposed to reconvene in the spring of 2022, when the French will have just emerged from an election cycle. So there are those sort of difficult realities that we need to contend with. Because what would need to happen, Sandy's already laid it out, you need in part very basic things, which is, what are the Russians still mostly afraid of? It's our capacity for our missile defense systems, the air and ground missile defense systems. They need to clearly be modernized. They need to be strengthened. They need to be reinforced. And you need to flank that with everything that Linas pointed out, which is greater interoperable capacities to push back on hybrid pieces. The sanctions policy not only needs to be continuously reviewed, but then of course used, looking at evidence metrics to see what actually works. Are we pulling the noose tight enough? And are we nimble enough in the application of sanctions policy? I do think that has, quote unquote, helped to coalesce the Europeans, sort of all the panoply of sort of moves that the Russians have made that has hardened the European or the wider European line. But you'd need to invest in sort of traditional defense structures. It's a difficult argument to make on the German side. And then you need to, exactly what the United States is undergoing now or beginning now is a modernization of the nuclear arsenal. And there again, I think you need strong core European buy-in in the fact that that absolutely needs to happen, of course, governed by, continued investment in proliferation or sort of in stable agreements. So looking again at how you might make New START sort of fit for purpose in the future. But those are the things that you absolutely need. And those are the hardest arguments to make to European electorates, but certainly to a German electorate who would rather, quote unquote, see defense investments go into hybrid threat, climate change, things that don't imply German panzers, quote unquote, or German heavy artillery rolling down any kind of streets, quote unquote. And so, there's sort of the needs assessment, I think, is clear. And then you look at what is the timeline and what are the political realities on the ground. And this is, those two components make me very concerned, which is why I want to have Linas come to every German marketplace and rewrap that again to say, look, this is really the panoply of threat portfolio we're dealing with right now. And in order to find a cohesive approach that, to Sandy's point, also speaks to the Europeans being able to deliver on these challenges on their own. Because frankly, if the Americans want to preserve, to Sandy's earliest point, the integrity of American democracy and a re-election of a democratic small d president like Joe Biden again in some form, whether he's Joe Biden or he's an African-American female going forward, they're going to have to invest precisely in these things that traditionally they have not wanted to invest in because it's been very convenient, quote unquote, to hide behind the American security umbrella. Those days are over, and the German publics and the European publics need to understand that very clearly, and they need to understand it very quickly. And that's where my worry lies.
I'd like to close with just one follow-up question to Sandy Vershbow. Sandy, you talked about that you called for a higher European level of ambition, and you talked about a European level of ambition to provide 50% of the combat capabilities and enablers, if I understood correctly. If I look at the German debate about defense, it has been evolving away from the fixation on the 2% kind of input target, but at the same time, it's had greater openness to a focus on the outputs. That increasing German responsibility should be measured against the required capabilities rather than some abstract number. With all that in mind, do you think the level of German ambition up to now, which has been basically to provide 10% of NATO capabilities, do you think that falls short of where Germany should be?
Yeah, I do. I think that Germany should aim higher. It may be, again, wishful thinking on my part, but the nature of the security environment has changed. And I think the leadership, both today and after the elections, has to somehow get through to the German people that freedom is not free, the basic message. And that the US isn't going to pull all Europe's chestnuts out of the fire when it has so many other things to do at home in the Asia-Pacific region at the same time. So the 50% rule I suggest may be rather crude, and a more nuanced approach may make more sense. Focusing on outputs, if that makes it easier for Germany to set the right priorities in its defense budget, that's fine. I'm not wedded to 2%. It is a very crude metric, and we only have 3 more years to go. Maybe we do need a different metric after that. But I do think that there are enormous challenges that can't be met if Germany artificially limits itself to 10% of total NATO capabilities. Cathryn, I think, said things I agree with 100%. I won't repeat those. I would add one more thing on the to-do list for Germany, which is doing more to help ensure Ukraine doesn't fall, because I think that would be a tremendous defeat for the West, and it would be a way for Putin to cement the Yalta II arrangement that he wants to impose on Europe. And I think if we believe in the rules-based international order, Ukraine's survival, with all the challenges that Ukraine presents in terms of backsliding on reform and lack of anti-corruption measures, Ukraine is very hard to help. But their strategic importance should not be underestimated. And I think Germany could do more in helping strengthen Ukraine's defense, which is a hot button issue. I know only the Greens seem to be for arming Ukraine. But Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself if NATO membership is not on the immediate agenda. We need to do the second best thing, which is help Ukraine make clear to Russia that it would face a heavy price if it launched another invasion. And that may enable diplomacy, which has been moribund, to succeed where previous efforts have failed as well.
Well, I think you've touched on issues that would allow us to talk for another hour, but we don't have that time, unfortunately. So I want to thank all of our viewers today for their questions and participation. I especially want to thank Linas Linkevičius, Sandy Vershbow, Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook for being panelists with us to help us get deeper into these issues, and also to Spencer Boyer from the U.S. Department of Defense. And lastly, I want to thank the U.S. diplomatic mission in Germany for providing support that has enabled this conversation to take place today. And I want to wish everybody a good rest of your day. And we look forward to following these issues together with you in the months and years to come. So thank you very much, and all the best. Bye-bye.